assignments, anything. I mean, stuff with assignments should be over by now. I've seen a lot of people, and those who want to see me will have already written. But is there anything you want to bring up before we move on to the next topic? No? Everybody's happy? Okay. Good. Either happy or resigned. You have the handout from last week, and I said that the handout that I gave you last week covers both weeks, and the second section of that covers issues to do with translation and the colonial encounter. What I'm going to try and cover now with you is stuff that is not already on your handout, so that the idea is that you use these things as a way into the topic, and that you, if you're interested in that area, you do a lot of your own research, you pursue whatever line in particular appeals to you, and you follow that through. So in talking about translation, post-colonialism and empire, am I imagining, or is there a sound of something, music? Yeah, yes. Radio.
Oh, someone maybe.
Somebody's got a volume or something on, and I can hear myself talking. It's pretty distracting. Hello?
Oh, no.
Something is difficult to concentrate with. Yeah, it's this one. That's the culprit. Okay, thank you. Thanks. Okay, so some of the issues you need to think about if you go into this area, which is extremely interesting, very, very rich area. You can pursue many different lines of research. One is to do with translation as an instrument of domination, particularly in terms of translating into and out of the languages that are constituting the colonial encounter. So if you're looking at, for instance, the occupation of India for a long period of time by the British, then you can look at either translations out of English into the Indian languages or out of the Indian languages into English, and you can see the patterns and what each type of translation was meant to serve within the colonial encounter. Okay? And I should say that translation and interpreting have been implicated in various campaigns of colonialism for a very long time, since there ever was any colonial encounters. Even things like the colonization of Latin America several centuries ago was enabled by people who worked as interpreters and translators, and who aided the invading armies in communicating with the natives and conquering them in various ways. And even in places like the United States, and issues to do with the indigenous population and how the Red Indians were dispossessed of their lands and property and so on. All this was enabled precisely through many different acts of interpreting and translation, some of them involving conning, if you like, fooling the indigenous population into thinking that they were not really parting with their properties, for instance, or relying on the fact that perhaps for the indigenous population in the United States, since there was no notion of property as such, because the land belonged to everybody, they didn't really know what they were signing away in their language or in any other language, so that whatever roles the translators and interpreters took on had huge ramifications in terms of the way that we know the world today, how it kind of panned out. So one of the issues concerns translation as an instrument of domination, and that can be achieved in both directions, as we will see in a minute. Secondly, there's the issue of the way in which translation was absolutely instrumental in enabling, and continues to be instrumental in enabling, various versions of what is known as the Civilizing Mission, the kind of 19th century effort to civilize the rest of the world, to make it an image of the Western world, of Europe. In the past, it used to take the form of bringing Christianity to these godless people who lived like animals because they didn't know Christ and had to be taught the right kind of religion and so on. Today, as you will see in a minute, it takes other forms. We bring democracy to countries that lack democracy and have to be taught how to behave like us civilized people, and so on. So translation is very much part of that effort, the Civilizing Mission, where the colonizer always, I mean, there has to be a justification for the colonization project, and the colonizer always structures the encounter as one between civilized peoples in various forms, either because of the religion that they adhere to or because of democratic principles of politics and so on. The encounter with that civilized entity with non-civilized groups that and you have to sell it as it is in their benefit to be brought to the kind of civilized world. And translation and interpreting are absolutely instrumental to that. There's the whole issue of anthropology, particularly if you're interested in anthropology or ethnography. You know what anthropology is, the kind of study of various peoples, cultures, and so on. And today anthropology has been kind of opened up to include all kinds of cultures, including subcultures within the same nation. So you could go to, I don't know, somewhere in Wales and study a small group of kind of Welsh speakers in Wales, and you'd still be doing anthropology. But in the old days, and particularly in the 19th and early 20th century, anthropology was very, very much part of the colonization effort. And these anthropologists who went to exotic places and studied these exotic peoples, in the Amazon and places like that, made them sound so exotic and studied them, learned their languages, translated what these people said or did into the language of the colonizer, brought that information back home, and that information was instrumental in enabling the military and the politicians and so on in deciding what to do with those other people and how to bring them to civilization. So anthropology has a long history of being associated with the project of colonization. Today, ethnographers are far more self-reflective.
The U.S. still uses them anyway.
Sorry?
We all know the U.S. still uses them anyway.
Of course. Indeed, there was a big fuss last year, a big scandal where the U.S. and Britain wanted to use anthropologists to send them into Iraq and Afghanistan and places like that to do some field work to support the kind of the mission of the army and the military. And there was a lot of fuss among academics. A lot of anthropologists refused to have anything to do with it and said you will actually not only discredit anthropology as an institution today, because anthropologists are much more self-reflective, but you will also endanger the lives of anthropologists working in that area, because they will be distrusted and they will be, treated as enemies. So, but traditionally, anthropology was very much part of that project and didn't argue with it. They saw themselves, anthropologists saw themselves as really kind of civilizing the uncivilized as well. Today, increasingly, but also historically, translation is also used as a way of defaming, othering, demonizing. When I did the session on narrative theory, I gave an example of MEMRI, the Middle East Media Research Institute, which is based on a very large translation project, which is really designed to make Arabs, Iranians, people who spoke Urdu Pashto in Afghanistan and so on, to make them appear as a threat to the civilized world and to demonize them. And that process is very important if you're going to colonize, if you're going to invade other countries, because you can't drop the number of bombs that were dropped on Iraq, for instance, if you really believe that these people are the same as you. So this is part of the colonizing project, this othering, this demonization, this defamation and stereotyping of other cultures. And translation, again, is instrumental in this. Another issue which you need to think about, I won't cover it in this seminar now, but there is something on it in your handout which you can follow through, and it's an important thing to remember, is that we tend to take a very broad brush to these issues and assume that anybody who's part of the colonizing society will have the same attitudes towards the colonized. But in fact, if you look at, the more historical research is done, the more we become aware that many people who belong to the so-called colonizing societies have taken over the years very many different positions in relation to the colonized. The paper by James James Saint-André, which I've included in your handout. I made some notes on your handout. It's very good in this respect. It shows how two British subjects during the 19th century, living at the same time, working with Chinese material, took very different positions in relation to the Chinese, one working to the system in the context of the existing dominant system and portraying, making every effort to portray the Chinese as unjust, as uncivilized, as very negative terms, and the other working very hard to develop the exact opposite image, to say that they are people just like us with a different kind of set of behaviors and practices, but rational and coherent within their own setting and so on. So you have to look at the variation in the positions and not just assume that there is a block of people who belong to the colonized world and a block of people who belong to the colonizing world and that they are homogeneous. And of course also the colonized include a lot of collaborators, a lot of people who look to the colonizer as an image that they want to emulate, want to further their own projects. So there's a lot of variation and diversity. And finally there's the issue, and the point, of course, is that all these people use translation and interpreting precisely for these reasons. And finally, the various forms of resistance that relies on translation and interpreting, resistance to colonization, to empires, to current, for instance, US hegemony, and so on. And that includes, in particular, one interesting area that some of you might want to look into is the issue of bilingual poetry, poetry that is written using the language of the colonizer, the language of the colonized, and in a sense trying to undermine the language of the colonizer by bringing in these elements from the language of the colonized, and also to exclude those who are not part of the colonized society. Okay, in terms of translation as a tool of domination, first issue that I said we'd look into. Historically, translations have been done into the colonial language as a way of controlling the people. So William Jones, who is very well-known intellectual scholar, who was also one of the governors of India for the British rule, did a lot of work himself in documenting the language, developing in understanding of Sanskrit and other Indian languages, and translating things like the Indian laws into English, not because he wanted people to kind of communicate, have empathy with the Indians, but because he believed that if we're going to govern the Indians, in order to control them, we have to understand them better. So we translate their stuff into our language in order to make sure that we understand them and we can control them better. And what happened in that context is very interesting. Robert Young, who is a well-known theorist of post-colonialism, writes about this in particular, where people like William Jones would translate material, Indian material, including not just the codes and laws and so on, but also some literary material, translate them into English, and then that English version would then be offered to the Indians as the reference point, so that unusually, in terms of the way we think about translation and source text and target text, it is the target text that becomes the reference point. It's the target text, it's the translation that becomes more important than the original, more authentic than the original. If there is dispute, it's what is understood through the translation that matters. And the Indians then had to conform to what the English translation says, not to their original text, as it were. In terms of course, part of the colonial project is also to translate into the language of the colonized, because by translating into the, say, Indian languages, into Arabic in the case of Egypt, into Chinese in the case of China, what you're doing as a colonizer is disseminating your own values. It's part of the Civilizing Mission also to some extent, but disseminating your own values and constructing for the colonized images of behavior, standards of behavior that they can, over time, come to see as the models to follow, as it were. So when you translate particularly literary material, for example, into another language, you're offering not just textual fragments and so on, you're offering characters, types of life, lifestyles that people come to not just become familiar with, but come to see as the optimal way of living. And this is precisely what people talk about when they talk about the effect of Hollywood worldwide. I mean, Hollywood disseminates images of and lifestyles and brings to the rest of the world the dominance of American values and American ways of life. So that's translating into the language of the colonized, or I mean, we don't talk so much about colonization anymore. I mean, there's no sense in talking about, say, Sweden being colonized by America. It's not like the relationship between Britain and India, but it's still a relation of cultural domination, cultural hegemony, because the flow of translation in the direction of places from, say, the U.S. and Britain to Sweden, China, Japan, and so on, is such that it is the hegemonic languages and cultures that set the agenda for the rest of the world and set the models of behavior and values and so on. Okay. Now, in terms of the civilizing mission, as I said, the civilizing mission can take different formats. This quote is from another Indian scholar. A lot of the material you will see in terms of, in relation to the theme of translation and colonialism and post-colonialism, a lot of it deals with India, because India was a particularly rich source of study and theorization in this context. But here, Sengupta is talking about, again, translation in the context of India and the colonial encounter between Britain and India, and she talks about translations into from the Indian languages into English, and she says that the Indian texts were rewritten into English, largely according to a pattern that denudes them of their complexity and variety. So the translations into the language of the colonizer try to portray the colonized as a homogeneous group, as simple, naive, uncultured, sometimes very spiritual, otherworldly, exotic, and so on. Such a rendition, she says, clearly justifies the colonizer's civilizing mission, through which the inherent superiority of the colonizer's culture is established. So through translation, the colonizer establishes their own superiority with respect to the colonized. If you want to have a look at some of this material, you'll find very concrete examples of, for example, translations of poetry from Indian languages into English, which would include or exclude particular motifs that help to give a picture of, say, the Indians as spiritual, otherworldly people, not quite like us. They don't do quite the same things as us. So there are patterns of omission, of motifs, of stretches of text, and so on that fit with that picture. In terms of the religious angle, a lot of translation done during the long period of colonization in the 19th century and the early 20th century had to do with minds, morals, and bodily states to a superior level of existence. So by teaching them Christianity, we teach them to behave to a certain set of values which we, in our own societies, the colonizers, respect and value. And essentially part of this idea of bringing civilizations through translation, largely through other means as well, but very much through translation to other society, means that we have to construct those other people in our own image, because we are convinced of our own superiority as a colonizer, and therefore we translate, for example, our own texts for them. We translate the Shakespeare's, we translate the Bible, we translate whatever we think encodes our values, the best things about our own societies, and then they have to just emulate this. It becomes an image for them to strive towards, to become like us. That is the kind of epitome of being civilized, is to become like us. Okay? And part of that here in this study remember Hafziba Israel gave one of the seminars, some of you may have attended one of the seminars here, and she talks about translation of the Bible into the many different Indian languages, because there are quite a few Indian languages in India, including Tamil. And of course, every language and community has its own original scriptures, not the Bible, but its own Buddhist texts and so on. And the idea was to translate the Bible in a very standard way across the different languages, so that there could be a unified vocabulary that all the different communities would use. And that vocabulary had to be very different from the vocabulary of their own scriptures, because you had to effect a whole rupture from that past, separate them from that past, separate them from whatever constitutes the images and values and ways of life that are associated with those scriptures, and give them completely new models to adhere to. So this is part of the civilizing mission. Cut them off from their own traditions, and unlike what you sometimes, you're told about translation, you have to take the expectations and the current culture of the target reader in mind, in order to not to effect too much of a rupture, so that they can be give them enough familiarity to be able to relate to the text and so on. In some contexts, in the colonizing encounter, the idea is to not to do that, but to cut them off completely from their own traditions and give them completely new concepts, so as not to be confused with the concepts that they inherited through their own religions and so on. This is, we're looking into the current situation now, which we don't have the, I don't know what you would call the invasion of places like Iraq and Afghanistan now, but colonization tends to be associated more with the kind of British and French and Italian and German activities during the 19th and early 20th century. But the civilizing mission today, which maybe we associate more with empire, takes a somewhat different form, and this is one example. This is a project which is based in the United States, and it's set up by people who are actually politically quite good in many ways. They really, they speak out on behalf of the Arab world. They speak out against kind of demonization of Arabs and so on. So they're not like Memory. Memory has a very clear agenda, the Middle East Media Research Institute, and it's very clear what their agenda is. These are people who actually have empathy with the Arab world and believe they are doing the right thing. And this is a project called Global Americana, and this is the kind of form it takes. It's called the Arabic Library Translation Project. Its board of directors include people like Juan Cole, who is, one of the good people that a lot of Arabs respect and trust and so on. And what they do, they think they're doing the same thing, but it's to me, it's an extension of the civilizing mission. They want to translate a lot of American texts in particular into Arabic and disseminate them in the Arab world in order to help the Arab world. And so it says, for example, the classics of American thought and history have been little translated into Arabic. We have therefore begun a project to translate important books by great Americans and about America into Arabic, and to subsidize their publication so that they can be brought inexpensively. Okay, so we're going to choose the best of our books and so on, the ones that we really feel are important, and translate them into Arabic. We intend to have all the founding fathers translated: Madison, Franklin, Washington, Paine, and so on. We would also like to see works that treat issues in democracy, multiculturalism, as well as engaging histories of the United States. So we are trying to translate all this stuff into Arabic, because the Arab world could do with better sources of information, better sources of inspiration in terms of work on political thought, obviously political science, on democracy, on multiculturalism, and so on. Obviously, at the back of this agenda is that the Arab world is lacking in these things, and even if they don't realize that they need it, we know that they need it, and we're going to give it to them. If you look at the kind of reports that actually are undertaken, and research undertaken about what the Arab world itself chooses to translate, what it is interested in. This is a group called Next Page Foundation, a very respected group that does all kinds of research on the area. And it says in one of its reports on domestic publishing in the Arab world, the prevailing attitude in the design of translation projects, that's the projects that the Arabs themselves choose to initiate, is that it's good to know about the outside world, rather than that it is necessary to promote the transfer of knowledge in certain areas to confront development issues in the Arab world. Today, it's not specific to the Arab world, actually many other parts of the world, if you like, democracy is one of the replacements or alternatives to Christianity in terms of the civilizing mission, and the other alternative is the development model. Every year there are various development reports produced by what are they called? The Arab. The human development, it's called reports called human development reports about various parts of the world, and they tell you, what each part of the world does in terms of, among other things, how much it translates, from where it translates, what kind of books it publishes, how the women are treated, what rights the women have. That's almost every year these reports come out, and these reports are done within the framework of development. So there is something called development. It's like Christianity, democracy. There's something called development, something that all these places should aspire to, and the parameters, the guiding principles of how to achieve development in that sense is provided by the West, by America and Europe, because it worked in the West, so it must be what they want as well. Whereas what the research suggests that what the people want is they want to know about what's happening elsewhere in the world. They want to know what the other people do, but not within a development frame, not because they think it's a process of a transfer of knowledge from one end to the other, but because it's a matter of exchange, of knowing about the world. So all these things continue to play a role. All these agendas, colonial agendas, which started way back centuries ago, continue to be affected very largely through translation and interpreting, but they just take slightly different forms, whether it's Christianity or democracy or development. We're still talking about largely similar patterns. Okay, any questions or issues you want to raise? No? Right, in terms of anthropology, one of the best papers you'll ever read on this, and I would advise you, particularly those of you who really want to engage a little bit more with issues of theory and ethics and the colonial encounter, is to read this paper. It's become a standard reference in many disciplines, a paper by Talal Asad published in 1986. But it's in the critical readings collection that I edited recently. And he talks about the encounter between anthropologists who, particularly in the past, particularly really represented the dominant, colonizing, literate, highly educated, powerful world, and the people, the cultures that are being studied. And he talks about strategies of translation and how you ensure that the anthropologist is not simply bending the culture and forcing it into a mold that doesn't necessarily represent the culture, but doesn't necessarily represent what the culture thinks about itself, but represents what the receiving readership in, say, America, Britain, France, Germany, wherever these anthropological works get published, what they expect, what they can understand, what they expect to understand and read. And the idea that particularly the anthropologist is very much something that you have to be aware of as a translator, what role you're playing in terms of how you interpret the text that is coming from another culture and that you are mediating in some way for another readership. And the idea that the anthropologists, because of their very powerful positions, because they are very highly educated academics who are often dealing with illiterate cultures, people who can't read and write and so on, they assume a certain sense of superiority. They assume that they can read implicit meanings in the language of the other people, that they're studying, in such a way that these meanings, if you explain them to the people from the other culture, they wouldn't recognize them themselves. But they assume, like the psychoanalyst, that they sit down with some kind of a patient and they know better than these people what these people mean when they say such and such a thing. Okay? So there is an element of ethics and of course power here, which, as I said, is very important. And here he talks about, again, this has an important implications for ordinary translation. The idea of the idea of whether the person you are translating for, or the person you're translating, the person who wrote, or the people who wrote the text that you are translating, are in a position to contest your representation of that text. And that is why it's important very often in translation to distinguish between your own voice as a translator and the main text. And so people who wrote the text that you're translating often cannot read them. They cannot read the translations. They don't know what you've put in those translations to represent them. They don't know whether, they can't argue with it. They can't say, you're wrong, this is not what I said, I meant something else. And therefore you have to be very careful how you represent those people in a way that is as ethical as possible. And if you want to argue with them, or if you are not sure, perhaps you can put it in a footnote so that you distinguish between the two. But here Asad is talking about the fact that those illiterate cultures that are being studied by the anthropologists are so weak in terms of the power dynamic that the anthropologist assumes they know what they are trying to say. They assume they know their cultures. They go and write up those cultures in those monographs that become anthropological monographs that people read and believe and therefore treat that culture on that basis. And the worst thing that happens as well is that these representations that end up with the kind of dominant cultures of the world, they have a way of traveling back into the language of the weaker societies, and they become representations of the societies that those societies have to consume themselves. So they come to believe what the other culture has said about them over a period of time. So it's a very interesting dynamic and has a lot of ramifications in terms of how particular societies come to develop their own images on the basis of images that are forced on them through translation from outside. And that's what he says is it's not a question of charity. It says the good translator does not immediately assume that unusual difficulty in conveying the sense of an alien discourse denotes a fault in the latter, but instead critically examines the normal state of his or her own language. The relevant question is not how tolerant an attitude the translator ought to display toward the original author, an abstract ethical dilemma, but how she can test the tolerance of her own language for assuming unaccustomed forms. So if the members of the other culture are saying things that don't seem to make sense to you, you don't say, as some anthropologists have done, and he gives many examples, you see these are kind of really illiterate, uncivilized people, that it's an incoherent culture, what can you expect, you know, they are illiterate. You don't say that, you don't say they are incoherent, you say, what is wrong with my own frame of mind, with my own frame of reference, with my own language, that it can't accommodate these different ways of conceptualizing the world. So you, rather than try to force a particular type of coherence on that culture, you try to extend the frames of reference and language that you're working with to accommodate different ways of being. And that is to some extent what people like Venuti are saying, except that he tends to concentrate much more on disrupting the canon within the target culture for the sake of disrupting the canon within the target culture as well. I already mentioned memory before, right? I didn't, yeah, you know what this is all about, so you can go back to it just as an example of kind of defamation and demonization and so on. But there are other ways in which translation is used, particularly in kind of very wide circulation venues like media, which today this is current, that has an effect of othering, stereotyping other cultures, again as part of that extension of the colonial encounter between powerful and less powerful societies. This is extracted. Has anybody here heard of the Tiananmen Papers? No? I'm always amazed that the Chinese haven't heard of it. Do you know about the Tiananmen incident or massacre? It depends on how you want to call it. You know, this is again narrative issues. Does everybody know about the Tiananmen events? Yeah? Yes. The Tiananmen Papers is a collection of papers which came out first of all in translation, in English translation in 2001. So it's very interesting because the translation came out before the original, okay? And the story is that this is a collection of papers based on transcripts, actually they call it transcripts, of secret discussions that went on between the various leaders of China while they were dealing with the Tiananmen events. So Tiananmen events were happening, people were demonstrating in the street and so on, and these politicians are supposed to have been in somewhere, in some context, some room, sitting together deciding how they're going to do this. There were secret memos and so on exchanged, and somebody on the inside is supposed to have recorded all this and collected all the secret memos and so on, put them together, send them to somebody in America, a couple of professors in America, and said, here, do something with this. And these people then took them, translated them into English, and published them in English, and then the Chinese originals came out several months later. This is highly contested, and a lot of people and specialists have written, even in specialist journals, saying the whole thing is a concoction. There's no way anybody could have recorded this stuff, and it doesn't make sense. So there is a question mark about the authenticity of the whole thing, okay? And that, again, is another aspect of translation. I mean, we can't always assume that when something is presented as a translation, particularly in the colonial encounter, that there is really a source text. It could have been, the whole thing could be concocted, of course. But, whether it is an authentic translation or not, what is interesting about this, in the kind of current power struggle between the US, the West, and China, there's always a love-hate relationship between the two, and there is an issue of who's going to dominate the world in the end, and so on. What is interesting here is the way actual choices are made in the translation. So if you read, I don't know if you can see this or not from where you are, this is meeting between Premier Li Peng and Paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, 25th April 1989. And then you get a transcript, presumably, of what Li Peng said. And he says, it sounds very funny, the spear is now pointed directly at you and the others of the elder generation of proletarian revolutionaries. Now, I read something like this and I wonder whether this is really what he said. If he ever said it, of course. But whether this is really, the choice of strategy, because this is so exoticizing, this kind of language in English is so exoticizing that it makes you think these people are really weird people sitting, they are not like us at all. They don't talk like us, they talk in riddles, Resistance, one of the most of course, resistance takes many forms through translation in the colonial encounter, but one of the most interesting forms that you might want to look at is bilingual poetry. I mean, there's also bilingual, all kinds of things, but bilingual poetry in particular. And I put on your handout one example of bilingual poetry that is produced in Quebec. In Quebec, they often talk about it as a colonial context because there is this tension between French-speaking and English-speaking communities, and the idea that the French has been suppressed by the more powerful linguistic community of English, which also reflects the power of the United States and so on. And so you get this bilingual poetry, which is often, because these areas are bilingual, is often translated into the other language. And because the poetry, the poetry of resistance itself, juxtaposes the two languages and plays with the associations with both languages, it's quite difficult to translate, because you have these stretches in the other language. What are you going to do with them when you translate? This one is an example from, his pen name is Jean Arsenault, but his real name is Barry John Ancelet. He's a Cajun poet. That's a group in Louisiana, an ethnic group in Louisiana, which again at one time spoke French, and again felt that they were suppressed, their cultures, their language was suppressed by the dominant culture of the United States, which is English. And this is the part of the original, one of his original poems. As you can see, it's a mixture of English and it's very like the Speak White poem that I've put on your handout. It says, I will not speak French on the school grounds, I will not speak French on the school grounds, because the idea is that people from that group who spoke French at home were not allowed to speak it in school. So they were forced to speak the language of the majority, In the same way that if you remember, I think we had a session, one of the seminars on sign language interpreting at one point, and you may recall that deaf children also for a very long time in many parts of the world were not allowed to use sign language. They were actually forced to sit on their hands in school to stop them signing. So all these kind of things that relate to suppressing one language in favor of the dominant language can produce this kind of resistance, and often associated with the colonial encounter. And then it goes into French. Yes? I don't understand French, so I assume some of you do. But you can see also there's some English even in speak pas French on the school ground. So there's a lot of mixture of French and English. Now what does the translator do with this? If you look at, if you still have your handout, in the example of Speak White, which is the poem in Quebec, what the translator did was retain the English bits, but put them in bold. Okay, so that you repeated the same English bits but put them in bold. Here the translator retains them but puts them in italics, and that often seems to be the same strategy. I will not speak French and so on, and then you carry on, hey, those bastards aren't stupid. After 1,000 times it starts to get beaten into anybody's head and so on, and again you get the italics again, parlez français, to show you that the original bits were in English. That there was something else, and you don't parler français. Sorry. Yes. So the first bit is an exact repetition but italicized here. This kept let me just show you what it was before so you can see what the translator does. So this is ne speak pas French on the school grounds. Okay? But it's trying to reproduce the same effect of playing with the two languages and keeping the associations. So you don't the associations with for each language, not two, and so on. Okay, there are lots of examples of this kind of poetry, surprisingly enough, but a lot of people who see themselves as suppressed, or their ethnic group, their languages as suppressed in various contexts where there is another dominant language that kind of they feel suppresses their own cultures, they often resort to bilingual poetry in particular to express that protest against that situation and to, as a form of resistance of rallying others. Okay. I have put some references, the references in the PowerPoint itself that are not included in your handout. I've just put them here so that you can follow them through. And some of these things I've actually put copies of on your. I think I'm just trying to remember. Some of them you can access. This is the translator, so you can access it electronically anyway. And I think I've added a copy of that on the intranet, so you'll have more things to look at. But essentially, it's this whole area of colonialism and its extension in today's world under different titles and so on is very, very rich if you are interested in following this. And I think most of us, because of the nature of colonialism, most of us are somehow associated with this, either in terms of belonging to the culture of the colonizer or in terms of belonging to a culture that was colonized at one point or another. So it's something that students often, many students are able to relate to and might interest you to do something like this. And of course it doesn't have to be, Europe and its others. It can be other types of encounters. I mean, the encounter between Japan and Korea, for instance, if you're Korean or Japanese, it doesn't have to. You don't have to think of Europe and the U.S. at one end and then the rest of the world, because there are lots of other types of colonial encounters that you can relate to. Okay. Comments, questions?